Welcome back, designers. Today we're going to start a project that will likely unfold over the course of 2 weeks or so, and essentially we're going to return to some of our most basic design problems from the beginning of the semester. Taking a two-dimensional plane and putting cuts and folds in just the right places to make that piece sort of animate and come to life, or make a 2D to 3D transformation. On a most basic level, those 2D to 3D transformations, even if you were able to make enclosed forms, have a problem, and that problem is strength, structural rigidity. If we were going to scale this thing up to the size of maybe an architectural form, unless we were working with massively thick sheets of like folded steel or something, we'd have a strength problem. We could not get a form that was just cut and folded to stand up, and so architects use a sort of a laminated or a framed solution. The project we'll be designing will be something like this. This is an 8-sided platonic solid in icosahedron, and I've designed it flat, cut it all up, framed it using these basswood strips, and then refolded the whole thing so that it retains a significant amount more rigidity. The paper gives it form, the wooden strips give it a certain amount of strength. Now, in its most basic form, this is what we'll be working on. But if you want to like play with this idea and you want to kind of see where it can go, we can start to think about some basic architectural design. I find that it's maybe most fun to think of smaller scale structures when you're initially doing architectural design. Think, for example, of finding something like this and reimagining this as like a landscape, and kind of asking yourself, like, where would I place a treehouse into something like this kind of landscape? If that sounds exciting to you, then find a piece of wood sitting around the yard, or go to a park or something like that. Find one and sort of imagine what it might look like to design for this space. If that sounds like something you're excited about, the amount of wood I've given you may not be enough. This would be not bad for the basic framing, but we may need a little extra to round it out. Say we're doing multiple structures, and so we could also talk about riving your own wood strips out of something you have laying around. We'll need some really, really dry wood for that, and possibly even introduce you to some basic woodworking tools like the splitting or riving edge of a hatchet or a carving knife. But before we get into any of that other fabrication stage, we need to get our feet wet in a program called Adobe Illustrator to do some basic design work. So this is Adobe Illustrator, and what I have on screen here is similar to what we'll be working on in a second. The basic forms that I think are probably wise for us to start with would be a series of forms called the platonic solids. These are sort of basic geometric forms that are fairly easy to render out in software like this. They're probably even somewhat familiar to you. Think of the hexahedron, right, or the cube. It's a 6-sided square-faced object, which should be fairly simple to assemble. If these words are too fancy for you, just think cardboard box, right? A 6-sided box is a fairly easy form to render out. But in order to get to a point where we feel confident rendering these things out in Illustrator, we actually have to get a base level of familiarity with the software. So when you log into Illustrator, it probably doesn't even look anything like this. So why don't I completely shut Illustrator down and boot it up again so that you guys can see exactly how I set it up. Now, once you have Adobe Illustrator installed on your computer, you'll have to go find it. I'm running a Mac here, so I go to Finder, I go over to my Applications slider on the left-hand side, and because I'm going to be using Illustrator fairly often, I'm going to drag and drop the Adobe Illustrator icon all the way down into my dock here. It's just a way that I can kind of create a shortcut. So to get ourselves situated in Illustrator, it's probably not a bad idea to grab a sketchbook and a pen so that we can take a few notes along the way, because this is a really big program and there's a lot to kind of get tripped up on, a lot of technicals, but we've got a very specific task here. So let's go ahead and click Create New, and then I'll walk through some of the preferences as we go. Since the document that we're creating is going to essentially be exported to a printer, we might as well design for print. It's going to default to a letter-sized document that has points as its size. Now, we don't really buy paper as a point size here in the United States. We buy paper in terms of inches. So one of the first things we should do is redesign our document template to be 8.5 by 11 or 8.5 by 11 inches. From there, there's a lot of other things we can get sort of caught up in here, but let's just create this document and kind of get oriented here in what we're looking at. Before we talk too much about what's going on in our frame here, let's go up to Illustrator, Preferences. Now on a Mac, this would be Illustrator Preferences. If you're on a PC, this would be Command K. And what we're going to do is we'll pick User Interface out of our side here. Now this window here in User Interface can kind of customize each one of our sort of individual experiences with Illustrator. A couple things that we could do here is we could toggle the sort of overall lightness and darkness of Illustrator. This is really has more to do with eye strain and what you the sort of lightness or darkness of the room you guys might be working in. I'm going to keep mine here at this sort of medium gray. But more importantly, for your experience to match mine, let's switch the canvas color to white and go up to Selection and Anchor Display, and we'll switch our Zoom to Selection off. And what that will look like is just an unchecked box. Now, if you missed a couple things along the way, you could say, for example, switch our units to inches at this point, but we're not going to mess with that. Click OK. If you use the keyboard shortcut Command minus or Command plus, this is one that we'll use fairly often. That is going to be the keyboard shortcut for zoom. And if you zoom all the way out, you sort of start to see, start to get the lay of the land of what's going on here in Illustrator. And so in a sketchbook, it's sort of handy to do a real quick sketch of what we're looking at. There's a vertical bar on the left. There's a couple of horizontal bars on top. There's maybe a couple of palettes on the right. And we've got a tiny little window on the inside, and then sort of what looks like maybe the edges or some boundaries along the bottom. I like doing sort of a quick sketch of this because it's just sort of it's a much simpler way to get introduced to what's going on here in Illustrator than sort of looking at the screen. Now over here on the left, this skinny vertical bar, those are your tools, or what we'll call the toolbar. Each one of these tools has all kinds of really specific functions. Some of them even have multiple uses. If it has a little arrow underneath, or sort of in the lower right-hand corner, you can click and hold on it and you get sort of options underneath. The one specific that we can take a look at would be our shape building tool. Keyboard shortcut for that tool would be M or L, the rectangle tool or the ellipse tool. We'll come back to that in just here in a second. Now up along the top, we've got a couple of different toolbars. One of them is the control bar, and right on top of the control bar, this sort of like Illustrator file edit object type, that all stuff, we'll just call that our options bar. Now if you don't see your control bar, go to Window and turn on Control. You'll find that a lot of the sort of like appearances or sort of the preferences that you can kind of see or not see here in Illustrator are hiding underneath Window up on top. Now over here on the right, we've got a series of nested palettes. Now the palettes are really going to be customizable depending on what sort of project you're working on. You'll notice that I've got a fairly simple palette arrangement here. Yours might be much more complicated and include a lot of things that you don't need. First of all, the thing that you should take a look at is here, if you want to customize which palettes you're looking at, is go to Window, and all of these different sort of titles here are all palettes that you could potentially have open. Say for example Appearance, say for example Actions, say for example Color. Now some of these will just automatically pop up as you're working, and so it can get a little bit clustered, right? Now all of this space here I'm going to call your real estate. And you'll notice that almost immediately with just a couple of palettes opened up, you have a lot of exciting things going on, but way back here where we'll be doing all of our design work, it starts to go away. So you can do a couple of interesting things to sort of help arrange your palettes and sort of order them. First of all, you should know that you can sort of arrange them and they sort of snap to the edges of each other, and so you can kind of move them around and they kind of help arrange. You can also nest them. So say for example I really wanted appearance and color themes to sort of be in the same window. I can sort of nest the little tabs next to each other so I can kind of tab them back and forth. Say I accidentally opened Flattener Preview and I don't really even need that. The little X in the upper left hand corner just closes that down. Now the palettes that I suggest you have open sort of as we're beginning this project would be Layers. So go to Window, Layers. The keyboard shortcut for that would be F7. And I recommend having a couple open like the Align palette. Window, Align. Shift F7 is the keyboard shortcut for that one. Now, you may see me open up different things along the way here, and if I ever open up a palette that you're not familiar with, just remember that they're all hiding underneath here in Window. Now, the last thing I want you to take a quick look at is in the sort of workspace here. This is a little confusing to know what I'm looking at. This little window that we designed here is actually 8.5 by 11 inches. That window is called your artboard. Now, the artboard is essentially the part of your design window that would print if we click print. It's the exportable part of the project. Now, all of the space that lives on the outside of that artboard is called your workspace, or what Illustrator calls the canvas. So if you remember, just a few seconds ago, we changed the canvas color to white. That's going to be helpful for the sake of what we're doing, because we're going to do most of our design work here in black and white. Think of your canvas as your tabletop, your work area. At school, I can set up a whole studio space with 18 desks, and each desk is maybe 2 feet by 3 feet. That gives you a fair amount of elbow room, but the amount of workspace you have here in Illustrator, this digital workspace, gives you much more elbow room. And say we were designing multiple pages of a document, I could just go to my artboard tool and either copy my artboard to make multiple printed pages, or design my artboard to be whatever size I would want. Now I not only have 3 pages of 8.5 by 11, but a couple of other strange sizes that might be custom to a particular printer or digital export. I can also delete those extra pages right now if I don't need them. So something else that might be really handy for you to activate at this point would be the rulers. Command R, and you'll notice that down the edges of each one of your vertical and horizontal axes of your canvas board, you get these sort of ticked rulers. Now, what those are going to allow you to do is sort of set up a quasi-grid. This is going to be really handy if I click in my vertical ruler axis and I click in my horizontal ruler axis. I get these sort of marine blue looking vertical and horizontal guides. This is really going to be helpful in getting certain things to line up later on. Now, if you would like to actually have a little bit more control than that even, we can activate a grid. Go to View, Grid. Now, the grid is somewhat customizable, but in this case, it's about inch by inch size grid. If you would like that to be customized, that would all be in our Illustrator preferences later on. We can also activate things like our smart guides. I recommend turning on smart guides for now, and we'll get more into where we'll apply those sorts of things. That pretty much wraps our introduction to Illustrator. In the next tutorial, we'll get into our actual design.